Hi everyone, welcome to our guide to the NIST Cybersecurity Framework. My name is Philip Robinson. I'm joined today by my colleague Dan Gota. Welcome, Dan.
Good afternoon, happy to be here.
Happy to have you here. Thank you for joining us. Before we get into the slides, just a bit of housekeeping to go through. Everyone is muted today for the duration of the webinar, so if you do have any questions, I'd just ask that you pop them into the questions pane, and either Dan or myself will be answering them as we go along through the session. And there's going to be a lot of information that we're covering today because the NIST CSF is quite hefty. So we may be skimming over some areas in the interest of time, but we'll be emailing out the recording and the slides after the webinar, so you can go back through everything in more detail. And that's all on the housekeeping front. So let's just get straight into it, I guess. So firstly, just a little introduction about how the CSF came to exist. So the US doesn't have a single data security law for the private sector. Instead, it has separate laws for various sectors like healthcare and finance. And efforts to establish a uniform privacy and security regulation, or numerous regulations, are currently underway, but there are still a few obstacles to overcome, and they're not looking to be implemented anytime soon, I don't think. So to assist the private sector in addressing security issues, the US government has provided guidance through the Cybersecurity Framework, which was a voluntary program launched in 2014 by President Obama and is based on the Identify, Protect, Detect, Respond, Recover model that has since become a widely accepted international standard, and it allows organizations to adhere to existing security standards and comply with regulations, organize security controls into high-level groupings, and it just promotes a continuous approach to security within IT. And at the core of the CSF are 5 functional areas, and we'll just list them quickly here. So the first one is Identify. This element focuses on understanding the organization's cybersecurity risks, as well as its assets, vulnerabilities, threats, and impacts. Protect aims to establish and implement safeguards to prevent or mitigate potential cybersecurity threats, which would include implementing security controls to protect sensitive information and critical infrastructure. Detect involves ongoing monitoring for indicators of compromise and rapid incident detection. Respond focuses on developing and implementing an incident response plan in order to make you able to manage and contain cybersecurity incidents. And then finally, Recover is all about restoring normal operations as quickly as possible after a cybersecurity incident. And these functions are at the very top of the CSF hierarchy, and they represent the first sorting bin, if you will. And with the CSF, every security control in a specific standard can be assigned to one of these functions. So, for example, if we take a quick look at the PCI DSS, when looking at the higher level functions of PCI, you can see that some of these are very specific points, including implement strong access control measures. In the CSF classification, access controls are actually found under the far more general function of Protect, and that's really the point of the CSF. It does a far better job of generalizing and abstracting data security than a more specific standard like PSS does. So after the top level, the next levels in the hierarchy are CSF's categories and subcategories, and you can think of these as additional sorting bins. They're specific enough so that they can meaningfully classify all kinds of standards, but they're not too granular that it's as complex as the underlying standard itself. So, for example, under Identify, just take a closer look here, there are 6 separate security categories: asset management, business environment, governance, risk assessment, risk management strategy, and supply chain risk management. And then at the lowest level of the hierarchy, CSF lists subcategories that finally map to actual controls. So the table you can see on your screen shows the mappings of the identity function asset management category, and it's broken out by its subcategories. And as you can see there, in that last column, NIST maps into many of the most popular standards. And if a standard you're working with isn't listed, it's still likely that it's already been mapped somewhere. So for example, you might notice that PCI isn't actually mapped, but thankfully the PCI Standards Committee has provided the mapping in their own documentation. So it might be out there somewhere. And the NIST CSF isn't meant to be a replacement of a standard. Instead, it complements these standards by putting them into an overall security process, which we'll delve into in more detail in a second. And to emphasize this point, if your organization has found something like the MITRE attack framework useful when you're detecting and responding to malware attacks, and you've come to rely on its shared knowledge base, CSF doesn't stop you, it doesn't force you to stop using it. And the same can be said for PCI DSS and its controls when it comes to payment card information. And now we've covered the real basics of the CSF, we can move into the security process. So the model, the identify, protect, monitor, respond, recover model, is better viewed as sequential steps, with each step feeding into the next. So the best way to understand this is to go through a really simple example. Starting with the identify phase, an IT department, hypothetical IT department, inventories file system data, looking for PII, and collects associated access permissions. And then other information like network and server configurations are also collected. And these controls are found under the identity function in the subcategory asset management. The CSF then requires you to conduct a risk assessment. There we go. And this risk assessment will basically help you work out how you're going to manage the risks that are discovered. So it's worth noting here that unlike other standards, the CSF tells you that a risk assessment is actually part of the identify function. And that means in addition to inventorying your systems, you're supposed to review the current threat environment, decide the threats that are the most relevant and the most likely to occur, and then based on an analysis of your corporate assets, select which assets, select those assets where compromise and disruption would result in the highest expected cost. So in short, you're trying to get the most bang for your buck, basically. And let's say in this hypothetical situation, the risk analysis suggests that this hypothetical company is especially vulnerable with respect to data being kept on Windows folders and Windows file server. So the next stop in the NIST CSF is the protect function, where the appropriate controls are chosen to limit access. So in our example, we take a look at access rights and make sure we didn't have any users with excessive permissions. We'd want to look to implement procedures for maintaining those access rights, and then we'd look at technology to record unauthorized activities. So far, so good. You can see how it's a bit easier to talk about the security processes using the higher level CSF classifications. In the background, though, security teams would be actually implementing the actual controls based on the particular cybersecurity standard or security standard that their organization is using. And in our scenario, the IT team decides to introduce a new AD group, puts in place procedures to manage group membership, and then the team selectively turns on various auditing features so that access can be monitored. And with those controls implemented, our hypothetical organization is now ready to deal with a threat. So let's say, for example, maybe they're using the MITRE attack framework. The Security Operations Center discovered that Emotet is the malware that's infected the system and is the culprit behind unusual file activity. At a minimum, the SOC will have to disable compromised accounts, stop infected software applications, and remove malicious tasks, emails, and more. And in our scenario, the Emotet incident could then lead to any of the following recovery mitigations, like improved security training, auditing employee passwords, restricting access to scripting languages, and limiting access to other resources. And that's essentially what it might look like in a really basic sense. So, but thankfully, you don't have to start from scratch when you're evolving a security plan for your organization. So this makes it a little easier to deal with some common malware attacks and security challenges with their CSF profiles. The one you can see on your screen is for ransomware. These profiles are a fantastic place to start when you're figuring out how to apply the NIST CSF in the real world. And you'll find a link to this in the documentation that we'll send out after the session. So I encourage you to explore that in more detail. And it is at this point that I'm going to pass you over to Dan. So Dan's going to show you how the Lapide data security platform can be applied to help achieve some kind of alignment with the NIST CSF, particularly in the identify and detect phases. So Dan, over to you.
Nice one. Thank you very much, Phil. And again, good afternoon, everyone. So what we're going to do is we're going to basically focus on those kind of key functions that we've just gone through with Phil there. And we'll kind of build that story into this as we go through. So the first function that we had come up, that was our identify. So let's just take an example. So let's just say I'm tasked with identifying, as we mentioned, kind of where that sensitive data might be in your environment. Now, if you don't have the time or the staff and the resources to pull this off, this is where you can leverage the solution to complete that task in a very fast, easy, and efficient way, and also give you that audit trail that you might need to prove that compliance. So the first place we'll go is actually under classified files here. So let's say upon that first step, we just need to identify where that data might be. Well, once I'm in here and I'm looking at that data, I can then generate the report. The system will then go through and identify any compliance tag data that we may have. Now, what we can do from here again is, in this example, we could also look at compliance. So I could actually filter this down and go, well, okay, you know, I've got more than one compliance on the go here, but let's just say I'm just focused on PII. We can then type that compliance in, click on OK, rerun that report, and that will then filter that down and complete that task, and it will identify and show me the file server, the file path, the content type, so what we found within the file. Obviously, the compliance is filtered down to PII, and then we've got things like the count, the risk level, and monetary value. These are customizable to basically set the risk that you would consider for this result. And again, with that monetary value, you can add some gravity to what you have here. But again, this is filtered down just to pick up the PII, or both. I mean, we've got GDPR and PII and GLBA. So again, we'll go through, we'll filter that information. So now you know where those classified files are. You filtered it down to that important compliance. So, okay, great. Let's identify who has access to that data as part of that journey. And where we do that is under our permissions by object. So if we come over here, now we know where that sensitive data is, we'll sync this up to our file server, and we'll expand that kind of standard company share, those kind of map drives that you would expect to normally see. And then we can go in and actually identify that information. So I can pull down into like financial services, and maybe I can take a look at my finance folder. You know, I've got some PII tag data in this folder. So now I can look at this, and the report will show me the subfolders and the data within there. And then the all important part is actually here, which is where we now show you, okay, well, these are the people that have access to this critical data. And if I scroll down just to show you some users here, you can see who those users are, what's the level of access they have, what do they have, what don't they have in terms of access controls onto that folder. You can export these reports. So again, as part of that audit trail that you might need, we can do that. And we can also highlight any direct permissions applied to that folder and just come down and see if there's any there. Now, we also look for inherited permissions too. So, you know, we go the full way. So Marty, you can see here, is a great example. He's got full control in a number of ways. So even if we removed one of these, he's still getting it because it's indirect through. And as we hover over, I can see who those groups are. So we're not just going at face value, we are looking at any nested groups. And again, we can click onto this and investigate further. And I can see here that my admin group has full access to my finance folder, which, as we know, contains that sensitive data. Okay, well, who else is part of that group? Because they'll have full access too. Click on the cog, and that will then tell us all the other users who are part of the administrators group who has access to that finance folder. Which is great. So now you can export these reports, you can build a risk assessment as required, and you can decide how you're going to manage these potential risks. You know, we clearly need to make some changes here to permissions and maybe revise our administrators group. And this is where it moves us nicely onto the next part, which is protect. So now you've got your awareness, you've got the ability to provide the training, and get a strategy to protect the data. So coming off the back of this, we can actually come into here and we can actually right-click change permissions. So as part of that protect, you can actually make the changes from here on the fly. And again, this is just designed to save you time. You haven't got to log onto your file servers, find the folder, go in there. You can actually change those permissions from here and make those decisions on the spot. We can revoke those permissions if we need to. Now, also as part of that protection, we can also go into excessive permissions by object. So, as part of that kind of how do we protect ourselves from this, the solution can actually go through and identify gaps in potential security. So what we'll do is we'll look at that same folder. So if we just come down and we'll look at the finance folder again, what this is doing is this is, helping to protect us and saying, right, okay, in X amount of days, and again, you can customize this. So you can go custom 30, 60, 180, and it's looking at access across that date range. So down here, we can see who our users are, what's the level of control they have. We've got the data within the folder, and again, we've got that tag data in there. And basically, the blue ticks mean they've used their rights on that folder in the last 180 days, and the red ticks mean that they have not. So now the system is helping to protect you. Now the system is going, right, these are the gaps you have. These are people who haven't stepped foot in this folder and exercised any of those rights. Maybe we need to change that. So again, you can use this moving forward, identify any users, and basically make those changes required based off of this report here. So, we're identifying those permissions for you, but again, take that with a pinch of salt. Now you can run this report and say, well, maybe we want to start to implement some zero trust because, these are critical folders and I've got people here that don't really go in there much. So again, that can help you on that journey. Now, as well as, protecting and looking at those folder permissions, let's say you've set up your groups, you've got this locked down, you've got the relevant access to those critical directories, everything is in order. Now we want to monitor any changes to those groups. I want to be notified if someone's added to a group that will get access to this folder. That's where we can dive over to the alerts. And a great one we can look at is literally modifications to critical groups. So you've got those groups set up. Now part of the protection phase is we can go in and I can be notified when anyone is being added to those groups. And this then moves us on to essentially the next part, which is detect. So this is where you can take full advantage. You can start to set up those additional alerts to help detect any events or anomalies that may occur. And again, this does include the ability to create your own alerts from scratch. So you don't have to use these ones here if you don't want to. So again, you're fully covered there with all our alerting. Continuous monitoring of the data, as part of that detection phase, no problem. We can access that on the left-hand side here, and we can come into things like all environment changes. And what you can do is you can set your date range. Now it could be, today, yesterday, this week, or a custom date range if you know what you're looking for. Click on OK, generate the report, and you've got that continuous monitoring coming through, and you'll be able to see, what's going on, who's making changes around the who, the what, the where, and the when. So again, under component name, I can say, right, I just want to look at AD and file server, rerun that report, and then we can see what's going on in our environment. Now, all of these reports here, again, you can save these, so you've got that audit trail available. But you can see here at a glance, and I'll explain this. So this is giving you the who, the what, the where, the when information. So we can see here where I've got my user in question, and he's enabling an account, okay? And I can see he's enabling my developer account, and that's on Active Directory on my domain, and this is the date and the timestamp. Password resets, people being added to groups. So again, as well as having that alerting around those groups, you can come in here and just see an audit trail for anything that's being done, whether it's say on Active Directory or file server or many of the other platforms that are supported. And again, here we can see some file server entries of our developer account going in and deleting files. And again, you've got that date and the timestamp and the object path, so where that file was actually deleted from. So again, you've got that continuous monitoring. It's fully leverageable, so we can come in here and we can specify users, specific operations. We can go into specific object paths if we want to. So what about anomalies that may not be easily visible? You know, you've run an audit trail, but you might not be seeing any kind of strange behaviors or anomalies. It could just look like data as it does here. And again, this is where you can go in and you can leverage this report here, our anomaly analysis. Now, what this will do, this will start to very basically learn all of your users' general routines on a day-to-day basis. Now, the longer this is in place, the better it's going to get. But the moment that user steps outside of that normal routine, we can go in and we can identify that anomaly. So let's go on Justin, for example. He's been on file server and AD, 109 anomalies. And again, you can see very clearly here, those spikes in activity, and we can see things where he's done actions that he's never done before. So we can highlight over these and actually see what they are. So I can click on the 2 examples here, and then that will load up down here and tell me the date and the time of when that change was committed and what it was. So we've got a session locked. We've also got 8 files being copied. This activity has never been seen before. Now I can click on that, and then that will load up what those files were that he actually copied from the system. So again, you've got that continuous monitoring, but we can also spot those anomalies as well, any strange behaviors, disgruntled employees, people just snooping around. That is also available to be tracked and shown here. We've also got other reports, again, around strange anomalies. Under our permissions and privileges, we have activity outside business hours. So again, we can, as well as using that anomaly reports, you can also set up reports like this, pop in your opening and closing times, and anything outside of those times, we catch that here. And again, we can look at different components. So here I'm looking at AD and file server, and this will only show changes outside that time. And you can see here, you know, I've got sessions being locked at almost 2 a.m. in the morning, and you can see who the user is. You've got the timestamp, and they locked a session. We've got log offs, we've got deletions coming through at 7:30 in the evening. So again, you can leverage this to find those anomalies. Now, if you want to, you can also right click. You can schedule these reports and you can alert yourself to those. So where I mentioned those predefined alerts, you can create your own and you can set them up off the back of these reports too. So if something happens and you want to know about it, you can be. And this again moves us nicely on to respond. So you know, you've got those alerts and everything we have there, but maybe you want to respond more than just an email alert coming through. And that's where we can come back into these alerts. And part of that response behavior, let's say mass delete behaviors, I can click on edit. Now, as well as turning these on, I can actually customize these. So I can pop in those object paths, those critical folders that we've identified that contain PII data, GDPR, for example. The operation, we're looking at any kind of deletions. Under the who, we can specify that we want everyone to be able to trigger this alert, or you could exclude yourself, and you can set the threshold. And that's where you find that sweet spot for what you would consider a risk. So maybe, you know, 10 files within 3 seconds is a bit more your thing. That's where you customize that. But where we get onto the actual respond is where we go next. And again, we've got multiple delivery methods here. So you're able to configure an email alert. We've also got the live feed available. So that's one of the feeds on our homepage. Then we've got an app available as well, which is really cool. And again, any alerts that come through can come through to the dedicated app, and that's available for iOS and Android, and it's not missed. So if you get lots of emails a day, if you've got it coming through to the app, it's a focused view, and only our alerts are going to come through to that. So you can be, you know, set off and notified when that happens. Now, we can also set up things such as scripts as well. So as part of that respond, we can actually respond and use an automated script if we need to. Now, there are predefined scripts out of the box, and they're all available there. So one of the great things is that you can set this up, and then you can go, right, okay, well, when this mass deletion event happens, 1, I want to be alerted to it, 2, I want to have it come through to the app, and 3, I want to respond and run an automated script. And as you can see here, you know, you can disable the user, shut the server down. You could do both, disable and shut the server down. So you have the ability here to respond to these when they are triggered. And again, you can also customize and set up your own scripts. So they're available there to use, but if you want to create your own custom script based off of you know, a use case you may have, you can pop that in there and use that. And whilst we've actually been talking and setting this up, we've already got alerts coming through on the app. So on my phone here, we've already got alerts coming through for AD and potential brute force attacks. So again, this is all real time. It's a great thing to have, and you can basically respond to all of these threats as they may happen, which is really cool. And then finally, we're coming on to the kind of recover phase. So really, the recover phase is more of a collection of everything that we've just seen here. This entire journey has now given you a vast insight into your environment. So let's say you've identified some gaps. Let's say you've identified some low risk scenarios. It's not bad, but it's not great. So maybe we could implement something better in regards to those permissions. Maybe we can set up some additional alerts here and some responses on top of that. Maybe we've identified some critical data that could be accessible in multiple directories. Now you can provide the necessary security training to those exact users who need it. And again, that's essentially maximizing your time and your efforts moving forward in that recovery phase. So again, I hope that was helpful. That was a very quick stop tour, but I just wanted to cover off those kind of key component areas, which I think is great. And I'd say that kind of brings us to a close on this demonstration. I hope you found this useful. And Phil, I'm going to pass things back over to you.
Thank you very much, Dan. Yeah, very useful. And I hope that was very insightful to everybody on the session about how you can use a data security platform like Lapide to help align yourselves with some of those elements of the framework. Whilst Dan was talking there, I think I've managed to get to and answer most of your questions. And we had a lot of questions about the recording and slides, and some people that joined late asking about recording as well. So you will get a copy of the recording sent out. I think it will be in the next 24 hours, potentially. And you'll also get a follow-up email with a written version of this guide to the NIST CSF, which will expand upon some of the things we talked about today, and give you links to some of the resources and everything like that. So look out for that in your inbox. We also had a few commercial questions about Lapide as well, including how it's priced and licensed. So if you have asked a commercial question, we will make sure that one of our account executives reaches out to you to get it answered. Yeah, so I know everyone is incredibly busy. We don't want to be stuck on a webinar for any longer than we have to. So I think it's probably time we wrap things up. Look out for that email in the next 24 hours or a few days with that recording and the guide. But in the meantime, thank you everyone for joining us today, and we hope to see you again soon. Goodbye.